April 29, 1943. 28,000 feet above the outskirts of Berlin. The oxygen mask fogged with each breath Captain Robert Hayes took. His B-17 flying fortress, christened Lucky Strike, shuddered as flak bursts peppered the sky around them, black flowers blooming in the pale morning light. Through the plexiglass nose, Bombardier Lieutenant James Kowalski could see the sprawl of Berlin below. A gray maze of streets and rooftops stretching toward the horizon. But today, the bomb bay doors weren't releasing 500-pounders. Today's payload was paper. 30 seconds to drop point. Kowalski's voice crackled through the intercom, steady despite the metallic ping of shrapnel against the fuselage. In the radio compartment, Technical Sergeant David Chen hunched over a bundle of leaflets, each one stamped with Gothic lettering and official-looking Wehrmacht seals. His gloved fingers traced the edges of the paper. Crisp, authentic, perfect. Too perfect. Because these weren't propaganda urging surrender or promising better treatment as prisoners of war. These were something far more dangerous. The idea had been born 3 months earlier in a nondescript office in London's Broadway buildings, home to the Secret Intelligence Service. Major Edmund Whitley of MI6 sat across from OSS liaison officer Commander Frank Nash, spreading intercepted German signals across a mahogany desk. The Enigma breaks were yielding gold. Movement orders, supply routes, defensive positions. But Whitley saw something else in those decrypted messages. An opportunity not just to read the enemy's mail, but to poison it. "We've cracked their ciphers," Whitley had said, tapping a decoded Wehrmacht communication order. What if we showed them we had? The concept was psychological warfare, elevated to high art. Print authentic German military orders using real cipher codes. Orders that would be just plausible enough to believe, yet contradictory enough to sow chaos. Orders redirecting units to non-existent positions. Orders accusing commanders of treason. Orders announcing Allied breakthroughs that hadn't happened yet. Then deliver them in the most audacious way possible. Drop them from the sky over Berlin itself. Nash had leaned forward, understanding dawning. You want to make them think their entire command structure has been compromised. Precisely. If they believe we can read their communications, if they think Berlin headquarters itself has been infiltrated by spies feeding us their codes, it won't matter whether the orders are real or fake. The paranoia alone will do the work for us. The operation was christened Jericho Walls, a biblical reference to barriers crumbling from within. It required expertise from multiple Allied intelligence agencies. British cryptographers from Bletchley Park provided the cipher authenticity. OSS psychological warfare specialists crafted the disinformation content. And the RAF and USAAF would deliver the payload. But it was in the details where Jericho Walls showed its true sophistication. Each leaflet wasn't just propaganda. They were forgeries of actual Wehrmacht Fernschreiben, teleprinter messages, complete with genuine formatting, proper military jargon, and most critically, cipher authentication codes that only someone with access to current Enigma settings would possess. Some contained Geheime Kommandosache classifications, secret command matters. Others bore the stamps of OKW, the Oberkommando der Wehrmacht, Germany's supreme military command. The leaflets announced phantom Allied airborne landings near Munich. They contained arrest warrants for high-ranking officers accused of collaboration. They reassigned entire divisions to defend against invasions that weren't coming. And most insidiously, They included fragmentary intelligence assessments that suggested deep penetration of German communications networks. Drop in 5, 4, 3. Kowalski's hand hovered over the release lever. Below, Berlin's defenses intensified. Searchlights swept the darkness despite the dawn hour, and 88mm flak guns pumped shells toward the bomber formation. 2 miles to starboard, Hayes watched a B-17 from the 303rd Bomb Group take a direct hit, its fuselage crumpling before spinning earthward, trailing smoke and flame. 2, 1, bombs away. But instead of the familiar shudder of high explosives dropping free, there was only a whisper. The bay doors opening to release their cargo of confusion. Hundreds of thousands of leaflets tumbled into the slipstream, catching the wind, spreading like a blizzard across the German capital. On the ground, Oberst Heinrich Voss, a logistics coordinator at Wehrmacht headquarters in the Bendler Block complex, was finishing his morning coffee when a subordinate burst into his office. The young lieutenant's face was pale, his hand clutching several pieces of paper that he thrust toward Voss. Herr Oberst, these were found in the street outside. Dozens of them. They're Wehrmacht communications. Voss took the leaflets, his practiced eye immediately catching the authentic formatting. His blood chilled as he read. A movement order for Panzer Grenadier Division 3. Encrypted using what appeared to be a valid daily cipher setting, directing the unit to abandon its position near Kursk and redeploy to Cologne to counter an Allied amphibious landing. The order was signed with the authority code of General Feldmarschall Keitel himself. But Voss knew there was no Allied landing at Cologne. And he knew Panzer Grenadier Division 3's actual orders. He'd processed them himself 2 days prior. This was either a catastrophic administrative error or something far worse. His hand trembled slightly as he reached for the telephone. Within the hour, the Abwehr, German military intelligence, would be involved. Within 2 hours, paranoia would begin its malignant spread through the Wehrmacht's command structure. And within a day, German signals units would start questioning whether their communications had been compromised on a scale they couldn't fathom. Back aboard Lucky Strike, now banking hard to starboard to begin the long flight back to England. Hayes allowed himself a moment of satisfaction. They'd made it through the flak, and his crew was intact. In the nose compartment, Kowalski was already logging the mission details, though the official report would be intentionally vague about what exactly they'd dropped. Chen removed his oxygen mask and wiped condensation from his goggles. He thought about those leaflets now scattered across Berlin, each one a small grenade of doubt, timed to explode not with shrapnel, but with suspicion. Somewhere down there, German officers were reading those papers, their certainty crumbling with each line of authentic-looking text encrypted in their own codes. The sun broke through the clouds ahead, illuminating the bomber's path westward. But in Berlin, darkness of a different kind was settling in. The darkness of uncertainty, of compromised security, of not knowing who to trust. The leaflets were just paper. But paper, properly weaponized with truth and lies in equal measure, could strike as deeply as any bomb. Major Whitley had been right. Sometimes the most devastating attack wasn't about destroying what the enemy had. It was about destroying what they believed. May 2nd, 1943. Abwehr Headquarters, Tirpitzufer, Berlin. Oberst Georg Hansen stubbed out his cigarette and stared at the decoded leaflets spread across the conference table. Around him, 12 senior officers from the Abwehr, Wehrmacht communications, and the SD Sicherheitsdienst sat in heavy silence. The room smelled of tobacco smoke and barely suppressed panic. "Gentlemen," Hansen began, his voice measured but tight, "we must face an uncomfortable truth. These documents," he gestured at the leaflets, "contain cipher authentication that should be impossible for the Allies to possess." Across the table, Hauptmann Werner Richter from Signals Command cleared his throat. "Herr Oberst, we verified the encryption patterns against our April 27th settings. They match perfectly. The probability of random forgery achieving this is—" He paused, searching for adequate words. "Astronomical." "Then we change all cipher protocols immediately," snapped SS Sturmbannführer Klaus Dietrich, the SD representative. His tone carried the characteristic impatience of Himmler's security apparatus. See a problem, apply force, move on. "It's not that simple," Richter countered, spreading his hands. "Our entire communications network runs on coordinated Enigma settings. Changing them requires distributing new rotor configurations and key settings to every unit from Norway to North Africa. That process takes weeks. And if the Allies are reading our traffic—" He let the implication hang. Hansen lit another cigarette. "If they're reading our traffic, they'll know we're changing the settings, which confirms we know they've compromised us, which tells them their penetration has been detected." "Exactly. We're paralyzed," said General Major Franz Halder, recently transferred from the Eastern Front. "And that may be precisely their objective." The leaflets themselves were masterpieces of psychological targeting. One announced that General Feldmarschall von Kluge had been placed under house arrest for unauthorized communications with Moscow. False, but plausible enough given the growing Eastern Front disasters. Another detailed Allied knowledge of the Atlantic Wall's weak points, citing specific bunker locations and garrison strengths. True information mixed with lies in proportions designed to maximize uncertainty. But the most insidious documents were the fragmentary intelligence assessments. As if someone had carelessly dropped internal Allied reports, analyzing how deeply they'd penetrated German communications. These accidental inclusions suggested the Allies had been reading Wehrmacht traffic for over a year. They referenced specific operations, cited decoded messages, and casually mentioned German officers by name, as if discussing known quantities. "Could this be disinformation?" asked Halder. "A bluff to make us abandon secure communications methods that aren't actually compromised?" Hansen considered this. Possibly. But consider the risk they're taking. If we don't believe it, they've wasted an elaborate operation. If we do believe it and change nothing, they've warned us for no gain. The only logical reason to execute this operation is if they genuinely have penetrated our ciphers and believe the psychological damage outweighs the risk of us changing our methods. Or, Dietrich interjected coldly, there's a traitor. Someone in this building, perhaps in this room, feeding them our cipher settings. The temperature in the conference room seemed to drop 10 degrees. Officers who had worked together for years suddenly couldn't meet each other's eyes. This was the true poison of Operation Jericho Walls. Not just the compromise of codes, but the infection of trust itself. Within 72 hours of the leaflet drop, the effects rippled through the Wehrmacht like a stone thrown into a pond. In France, the commander of the 352nd Infantry Division received what appeared to be a genuine order to redeploy eastward to counter a partisan uprising. He spent 2 days seeking confirmation. during which his division remained effectively immobilized. By the time he confirmed the order was false, the Allies had learned valuable intelligence about his unit's response time and decision-making protocols. In Italy, intercepted German communications showed frantic exchanges between Rome and Berlin, as local commanders sought verification for orders that didn't exist. Radio traffic quadrupled as units double and triple-checked every communication, creating a massive signals intelligence windfall for Allied listening posts. The paranoia spread geometrically. At the Wolfschanze, Hitler's Eastern Front headquarters, daily briefings now included lengthy discussions about communication security. Officers who had once transmitted orders confidently now second-guessed every message. Was this authentic? Had it been verified through multiple channels? Could they trust the verification itself? May 8, 1943. Bletchley Park, England. Dilly Knox, one of Bletchley's chief cryptographers, reviewed the latest intercepts with barely concealed satisfaction. The Germans were drowning in their own doubt. Ultra, the Allied code word for intelligence derived from breaking Enigma, showed Wehrmacht communications had become simultaneously more voluminous and less efficient. They're questioning everything. Knox explained to Commander Alistair Denniston, Bletchley's operational director. Look at this exchange from 7th Army headquarters in France. 3 separate confirmation requests for a routine supply requisition. Before Jericho Walls, this would have been a single transmission. Denniston studied the decrypt. So we've increased their signal traffic, making our interception easier while simultaneously degrading their command efficiency. Precisely. And notice the cipher discipline is breaking down. Here, Knox pointed to another decrypt. An exasperated Oberst in Belgium sent a partially unencrypted addendum to an order because he was frustrated with confirmation delays. The fear of compromise is making them less secure, not more. But the psychological impact went deeper than operational confusion. In occupied territories, German soldiers began finding the leaflets, which had been carefully collected and redistributed by resistance networks coached by SOE. The Special Operations Executive, a Wehrmacht private in Paris, would open his locker to find a leaflet suggesting his commanding officer was under investigation for treason. An Obergefreiter in Holland would discover one detailing how Allied intelligence had tracked his battalion's movements for months. The leaflets became ghosts, appearing everywhere, impossible to suppress completely. And with each appearance, the question grew more insistent. If the Allies know our codes, what else do they know? May 15, 1943. Wehrmacht High Command, Berlin. The final shoe dropped during a meeting of senior staff officers with General Feldmarschall Wilhelm Keitel. The chief of OKW had spent the morning reviewing damage assessments from Operation Jericho Walls, a name they'd learned from an intercepted Allied communication that the British had deliberately allowed them to decrypt, another layer of psychological manipulation. The Führer, Keitel announced heavily, has ordered a complete review of all communications protocols. Effective immediately, all sensitive orders must be confirmed through courier delivery, in addition to radio transmission. Classification levels for Enigma use have been elevated. And he paused, and the officers present recognized the look of a man about to deliver catastrophic news. The Führer has expressed concerns about the loyalty of certain Wehrmacht officers. The Gestapo will be conducting expanded security investigations. A cold silence descended. The leaflets had suggested traitors in high command. Now Hitler himself suspected his officer corps. The poison had reached the very top. In London, Major Whitley received the intelligence report with grim satisfaction. Operation Jericho Walls had exceeded expectations. The Germans hadn't just questioned their communication security. They'd begun questioning each other. Wehrmacht efficiency had dropped measurably. Decision-making at every level had become sclerotic with doubt. And the true beauty of the operation was its sustainability. Even if the Germans eventually concluded the leaflets were primarily disinformation, the authentic cipher codes proved Allied penetration was real. They couldn't unknow that their communications had been compromised. The paranoia, once seeded, would continue to grow. In a small cafe in Lisbon, neutral territory where intelligence officers from both sides occasionally crossed paths, an Abwehr officer who'd known British intelligence before the war met his former colleague for coffee. The conversation was carefully oblique, but the German's question was clear enough. The leaflets over Berlin. Was it worth showing us your hand? The British officer, who'd worked on Jericho Walls planning, smiled faintly. Old friend, we didn't show you our hand. We showed you a mirror, and you're still looking into it, trying to figure out what's real. The Abwehr officer had no response, because it was true. The Wehrmacht was now fighting two wars, one against the Allies and one against their own uncertainty. And in warfare, doubt kills as surely as bullets. June 12, 1943. Combined Operations Headquarters, London. The morning briefing room hummed with controlled energy as intelligence officers from MI6, OSS, and military intelligence gathered around aerial reconnaissance photographs. Commander Nash stood at the head of the table, pointing to a series of images showing German defensive positions along the French coast. These photographs were taken 72 hours ago, Nash explained. Notice the 701th Infantry Division here, near Calais. According to their own communications, which they've now triple encrypted and sent via 3 separate confirmation channels, they've been ordered to fortify positions against an expected Allied landing. Major Whitley leaned forward. A landing we have no intention of making. Exactly. Jericho Walls didn't just compromise their past communications. It's compromising their future decision-making. They're so paralyzed by verification protocols and fear of disinformation that they're effectively doing our operational planning for us. The assessment was striking. German units across occupied Europe were now spending an average of 18 to 24 hours, confirming orders that previously would have been executed within 6 hours. The Wehrmacht's command structure, once praised for its decentralized initiative and rapid response, had become bureaucratic and hesitant. But the operation's success had created an unexpected problem. At Bletchley Park, cryptographers noticed something troubling in late May intercepts. The Germans were beginning to introduce random variations in their communication protocols. Not systematic changes, but unpredictable deviations designed to catch forgers. A unit in Belgium suddenly started adding local authentication phrases. Another in Italy began using personal recognition codes known only to specific officers. They're adapting, Knox reported to Denniston. Not efficiently and not in a coordinated manner. But the paranoia we've created is making them more creative in their security measures. Denniston considered this. Can we still read their traffic? For now, yes, but it's getting harder. And here's the paradox. The very confusion we've sown is generating evolutionary pressure. The units that survive our deception are the ones implementing better security. We may be inadvertently training them. This was the double-edged nature of psychological warfare. Push too hard, and the enemy adapts. The Germans couldn't fix their fundamental Enigma vulnerability. The mathematics of the broken cipher remained broken. But they could make exploitation more difficult through procedural changes. July 3, 1943. La Glaise, Belgium. Unteroffizier Paul Schmidt of the 12th SS Panzer Division huddled in a farmhouse basement with his squad, rain drumming on the floorboards above. In his hands, he held one of the leaflets, now months old, worn from handling and passing between soldiers. It contained an encrypted order supposedly from Berlin, redirecting his division to Denmark to counter a British invasion. His Oberscharführer, Hans Mahler, had told them to ignore it. Allied propaganda, Mueller had said. But Schmidt had noticed something. The encryption format matched exactly what he'd seen on genuine orders. The authentication codes looked correct. And 3 days after the leaflet appeared, they'd actually received a confusing communication from headquarters asking about their readiness for northern deployment. "Do you think it's real?" asked Private Koch, the youngest in the squad at barely 18. Schmidt folded the leaflet carefully. "I think it doesn't matter anymore if it's real. If command doesn't know what orders are genuine, how can we?" This was the ground-level reality of Operation Jericho Walls. German soldiers no longer had absolute confidence in their command structure. That psychological fracture, the sense that the system itself might be compromised, created hesitation at every level. When orders came to advance, men wondered if it was a trap. When orders came to hold position, they questioned if their commanders had been deceived. The Wehrmacht was still a formidable fighting force. German soldiers remained skilled and determined. But they were fighting with an invisible weight, the weight of institutional doubt that no amount of courage could completely overcome. August 20th, 1943. OSS Headquarters, Washington, D.C. The assessment report on Operation Jericho Walls landed on the desk of William Donovan, director of the OSS. The analysis was comprehensive, measuring the operation's impact across multiple vectors: communications delays, command efficiency, troop morale, and counterintelligence resource diversion. The conclusions were remarkable. The initial leaflet drop, several tons of paper delivered in a single mission, had generated effects far exceeding its physical scale. The Abwehr had diverted an estimated 1,200 man-hours to investigating potential internal security breaches. Wehrmacht communications efficiency had dropped by an estimated 37% in the European theater. And most significantly, German counterintelligence was now focused on finding traitors who didn't exist, rather than identifying actual Allied intelligence networks. But Donovan noted the final paragraph with particular interest. Recommend against repetition of identical methodology. Enemy has demonstrated adaptive response. Continued effectiveness requires evolution of deception techniques. He lit his pipe and considered this. Jericho Walls had worked magnificently once. Trying it again would yield diminishing returns. The Germans were wounded, paranoid, and confused. But they were learning. The next operation would need to be different, more sophisticated, leveraging the paranoia they'd created rather than simply reinforcing it. September 15th, 1943. Berchtesgaden, Germany. In the Berghof, Hitler's mountain retreat, the Führer listened to yet another report about communication security. His temper, never stable, had become increasingly volatile as the Mediterranean situation deteriorated and the Eastern Front continued its bloody stalemate. You tell me our codes are unbreakable, Hitler snapped at the assembled officers. Yet the enemy drops our own encrypted orders from the sky like confetti. You tell me our communications are secure. Yet I must learn of potential landings from enemy leaflets, rather than from my own intelligence service. Keitel attempted to explain the intricacies of cryptographic analysis and disinformation. But Hitler waved him silent. The Führer's paranoia, already substantial, had been fed by months of uncertainty following the leaflet drop. He now insisted on courier-delivered confirmations for major orders, trusted fewer of his generals, and saw potential traitors in every communications failure. The psychological operation had reached the highest level of German command. And while it hadn't broken the Wehrmacht, that would require years of grinding combat, it had introduced a corrosive element that weakened the German war machine from within. October 1943. Multiple fronts. By autumn, Operation Jericho Walls had faded from immediate attention, overshadowed by the Italian campaign and planning for the eventual cross-channel invasion. But its effects persisted like a chronic illness. German communications remained slower, more cumbersome, more prone to confusion. When the Allies landed at Salerno, German response was delayed by hours as commanders sought verification of intelligence reports. When partisan activity increased in Yugoslavia, Wehrmacht units spent valuable time confirming orders rather than responding immediately. The operational tempo of the German military, its ability to observe, decide, and act quickly, had been degraded. At Bletchley Park, the cryptographers continued their silent war against Enigma. The Germans never did discover the full extent of Ultra's penetration. They knew their communications had been compromised. The leaflets proved that. But they never understood how deeply, how consistently, or how catastrophically they'd been read. In later years, military historians would debate Operation Jericho Walls' strategic impact. Some argued it was a brilliant psychological warfare success that degraded enemy effectiveness at minimal cost. Others suggested it risked revealing Ultra's existence for temporary gains. But all agreed on one point. The operation demonstrated that in modern warfare, perception could be as powerful as firepower. April 1945. The war's end. As Allied forces pushed into Germany from east and west, they occasionally found the leaflets still tucked into German soldiers' pockets, preserved in unit archives, or pinned to command post walls. Some had been marked up with annotations, analyzed, debated. Others showed the wear of constant handling, physical evidence of the doubt they'd inspired. Captain Hayes, who'd flown that mission over Berlin in April 1943, was by war's end a major stationed in England, training crews for transport operations. He rarely spoke about the leaflet drop. It remained classified. But he sometimes wondered about those pieces of paper falling through the sky, each one carrying a payload of uncertainty. In the end, that's what Operation Jericho Walls had delivered. Uncertainty multiplied across an entire military apparatus. Not enough to win the war alone. No single operation could do that. But enough to slow, to confuse, to make the German military question its own communications at the precise historical moment when clarity and speed mattered most. The leaflets themselves were just paper and ink. But weaponized with authentic codes, strategic disinformation, and precise psychological targeting, they'd accomplished what conventional bombing could not. They'd made the enemy doubt themselves. And in the calculus of warfare, doubt compounds over time, accumulating like interest on an unpaid debt. The walls of Jericho, according to biblical legend, fell to the sound of trumpets. In 1943, the Wehrmacht's walls of certainty fell to the whisper of paper drifting through Berlin's sky. Both represented the same fundamental truth. Sometimes the most devastating attacks don't destroy what stands before you. They destroy what holds it together from within. The psychological warfare specialists who'd planned Operation Jericho Walls understood this. They turned the enemy's own codes into weapons, transformed doubt into a strategic asset, and proved that information, properly deployed, could strike as deeply as any armament. In the vast tapestry of World War II, it was a single thread. But it was a thread that helped unravel something essential: the Wehrmacht's confidence in its own command structure. And that confidence, once lost, could never be fully recovered.